Every once in a while, a person comes along that has us asking whether psychopaths are made or if they are simply born that way. To add to that debate is Joanna Dennehy. Joanna was born in 1983 in St Albans, England, to loving and kind parents. Her mother was a shop assistant and her father worked in security, and together they provided a happy and stable home for Joanna to grow up in. She was very sensitive. Her mother later said if she stood on a worm or something, she would be really upset if it died. She used to take them to bed with her. She was a loving girl. Joanna got good grades at school and loved playing netball and hockey, but so much of that charmed and gentle life that had been all that Joanna had known had also changed by the time she turned 16. By then, she had a 21-year-old boyfriend named John Chapman, and the two of them ran off together, leaving Joanna's parents and Joanna's old life behind. Joanna was a teenager, and she enjoyed having an older boyfriend that she could live with unsupervised. She could do whatever she wanted to do and didn't have to answer to anyone. But only a year later, Joanna would learn that some actions do have consequences. At the age of 17, Joanna found out that she was pregnant. Far from defending herself and her behavior after hearing the news, however, the pregnancy only seemed to tick Joanna off. She didn't want children, and even though she decided to keep the baby, it didn't look like that opinion was going to change anytime soon. Quote, "She came out of the hospital and the first thought in her mind is to get stoned," her boyfriend at the time, John Chapman, later said. But Joanna actually ended up doing so much more than just getting high. Joanna began abusing both drugs and alcohol, and she started self-harming. About 6 more years of this went by, and Joanna became pregnant again. This time, John saw the writing on the wall and he walked with both the children once their second child was born. Joanna then moved to Peterborough, where she continued to abuse substances and allegedly worked as a prostitute to fund her habits. It is possible that it was because of this work that Joanna's opinions of men began to change. But what is clear is that by the age of 29, Joanna had simply had enough of men. It started with a brief arrest for theft. During interviews, it became obvious to the arresting officers that they were dealing with something far more than just a petty, aspiring criminal. Joanna was admitted to a hospital for psychiatric treatment, and it was there that she was diagnosed with OCD and antisocial disorder, otherwise known as psychopathy. Joanna was now officially a psychopath, but once her treatment was over, she was released back into the public. It was only about a year later that Joanna would make headlines across the nation and become known as the most evil woman in Britain. Things escalated with 31-year-old Lukasz Slaboszewski. He and Joanna had only met in Peterborough a few days before, but Lukasz was already excited about their future prospects. He told his friends that he was heading off that evening to see a girl he was hoping would soon become his girlfriend. But unfortunately for Lukasz, he was very far off the mark. Joanna and Lukasz spent the night drinking, and then Joanna invited him to a home owned by her landlord. There, she enticed Lukasz in and asked him to put on a blindfold. Lukasz eagerly agreed, and once he had it on, Joanna pulled out a knife and began stabbing him. One of those stab wounds pierced Lukasz's heart and killed him. Joanna then hid his body in a dumpster and went on about her evening. But she could never come back from what she had just done. She could never undo killing Lukasz, and she could never put the feelings that murdering someone had stirred up inside her back into the box. Joanna knew that she wanted to kill again, and she lasted only 10 days before she gave in to the urge to do so. This time, she struck much closer to home. For Joanna, part of the whole ritual was the thrill of the hunt, the drawing in and enticing of her victims. Targeting women was out of the question. They were likely mothers, and Joanna could take mothers away from children, so it was men that she would go after. 56-year-old John Chapman, one of Joanna's housemates, fit the bill perfectly. Joanna flirted and seduced, and she drew him into her room. There, she toyed with him before turning to her tried and true. She told John to put on a blindfold and wait. And then, once he could not see her coming, she began stabbing him. Joanna satisfied her immediate urges by killing John, but instead of keeping Joanna satiated, this new murder only seemed to spur her on. Only hours later, and Joanna had her next fix in front of her. 48-year-old Kevin Lee. Kevin was actually Joanna's and her previous murder victim John's landlord, and Joanna already had him ensnared. Joanna was Kevin's mistress, but even Kevin could have had no idea what awaited him when Joanna invited him in that evening, or even that his other tenant was already lying dead in that very same house. Joanna got John into her room, and then she played with him. She convinced him to put on a black sequin dress, and then she told him to put on a blindfold. Kevin, like the others who had gone before him, never saw Joanna reaching for her knife. She stabbed him to death, and then she moved on to getting rid of the evidence. The first thing that Joanna had to dispose of were the bodies piling up around her, and to do that, she employed some unexpected tactics. Shortly after she'd first moved to Peterborough years ago, she'd met a man named Gary Richards, who went by the nickname Stretch. Joanna called Stretch and asked him to help her move and discard the remains of the men she'd just killed. And maybe, in one of the most bizarre twists and turns of the case, Stretch agreed. Stretch had fallen for Joanna all those years ago, and it looked like he simply couldn't do enough for her. Along that same vein was 36-year-old Leslie Layton, who was someone that Joanna counted on as a close friend. Certainly, it would seem close enough to ask for help in a time of crisis. Joanna managed to convince not one, but two people to help her dispose of the bodies, and the three of them drove around Peterborough roads looking for ditches to hide Joanna's victims in. Kevin would stand out amongst the bodies abandoned on the side of the road. The sequin dress had just been the start, and his remains were arranged in a sexually explicit pose to hammer in the humiliation. That took Joanna's victim count up to 3. She now had a plan, and it was a cold and cruel one. Joanna was now determined to kill at least 9 men before she was caught, and the pressure was building. She'd gone from lasting 10 days to giving in to her urges to mere hours, and time was ticking. She, Stretch, and Leslie were driving back home from dumping Kevin's body when Joanna snapped again. This time, her victims weren't her boyfriend, her housemate, or the landlord she was having an affair with. They were 2 men out walking their dogs. Joanna ordered Stretch to stop the car, and then she pounced. She caught Robin Breza in the shoulder and chest with her knife, and then she turned on John Rogers. She stabbed John over 40 times before fleeing the scene, leaving Robin and John to helplessly bleed out on the street. Fortunately for these 2 victims, timely medical intervention saved both of their lives. Back on her murder spree, Joanna then found herself the target. The investigators cornered her after finding Kevin Lee's remains, but almost unbelievably, Joanna managed to escape with Stretch before they could arrest her. She was on the run for 2 days before the authorities caught up with her, but in another twist in the case, Joanna seemed to enjoy the attention. Instead of being angry or sad that she'd been caught, especially before fulfilling her plan of killing 9 men, Joanna seemed to find it funny. Security footage of her arrest shows her laughing and flirting with the police officers. Maybe she was still trying to entice a victim, even at the very last moment. At trial, Joanna pled guilty to all charges and was sentenced to life in prison with a recommendation that she never be released. Joanna is one of only 3 women in British history to have ever received this sentence, one of the other ones being the notorious serial killer Rosemary West. Joanna was actually placed in the same facility as Rose West, but Rose was moved after Joanna threatened to kill her too. That's 10-Minute Murder for today. Brief and bingeable true crime. I'm Joe, I'm the host, and thank you so much for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you're a brand new listener, subscribe. You're an OG listener, I love you with my whole heart. And if either of you have not connected with the podcast on social media, do that right now. Links are at 10minutemurder.com. You can also go to 10minutemurder.com to send me an email, like this one from Mallory. Hey Joe, great podcast. I probably average about one person per week that I tell about 10-minute murder. And you're right, sometimes they look at you like you're strange. Like I'm weird for recommending a true crime podcast. I haven't lost any friends over it, though. Not yet, anyway. The reason for the email isn't to tell you all that. I actually want to know if you'd ever consider interviewing people involved in the cases you talk about during the episodes. I don't know how you'd be able to manage that in 10 minutes, but you're the expert. I think it would be interesting to hear. All the best, Mallory in SF. Mallory, thanks for the email. Yeah, I've kind of considered that. I think that it would be interesting. I agree with you completely. I have thought over the logistics of how I would make that work. And it would make the episodes take much longer for me to do because obviously I do this part that you've heard on this one, but then I would have to reach out to the different people involved in the cases and try to figure out a timeline of when they're available and I'm available and then edit all of that into 10 minutes and make that happen. It's a whole world that I feel like I need more people. I need to hire some people. I'm not asking, this is not me asking if you would like to apply for a job. You listening. I can't do that at this point, but I think that would be the next step. I would need to hire some people to help out in that way in order to make that happen. But I think it's a great idea, and I would love to do that at some point in the future of this podcast. So, yeah, we're on the same page, Mallory, and appreciate the email. Again, if you'd like to send me one, joe@10minutemurder.com. And that's it. That's your episode for today. Thank you so much for listening to 10 Minute Murder.